Well, perhaps we'll give this as the main topic, which has twofold aspects here. That is paying tribute to what Carl Jung did with these seminars on Kundalini Yoga. In other words, the greatest, from my perspective, from my understanding, contribution. And also at the very same time, to look at this enterprise and what perhaps was not opened to the field of Jung's consciousness, which in turn also set certain things in a certain trajectorial way, that we have this understanding about the phenomenology of what Kundalini stands for, what it represents. So a little bit of just that background. So you know that Carl Jung is known as the greatest psychologist of the 20th century, right? That's hopefully granted, that's given. And we also know that Carl Jung, though a student of Sigmund Freud, who is considered to be the father of analytical Western psychology, disagreed with his teacher quite early on and went off or on to develop his own theories, for which he is very well known. Among these theories and among his insights, we could even say research into the archetypes, the dream side, the interpretation of the dreams. You can actually go study and receive PhD in dream psychology. In other words, psychology of the dream. What was the greatest achievement and foresight from Carl Jung from get-going was the fact that he immediately got dissatisfied with the model of consciousness that Western psychology was working with at the time when he came to the scene. And in order to expand his understanding, he went straight to the East and into India in particular, not literally yet, not physically, but with his interests, with his research, and with his studies. So therefore, very quickly he arrived to this understanding that what is open to the field of psychology prior to that was very limited. So he wanted to present a very different model, a model which considers and incorporates that, what we could say, the whole Eastern approach to the psyche of the soul has been dealing in uninterrupted fashion for millennia. Whereas in the West, that was fragmented, that was fractured, because we know that what was considered to be psyche of the soul gone dry into the sand a long time ago, simply because everything was at the mercy of the orthodoxy of religious interpretation. So in a way, during the height of what the Christendom is known and represented, even to speak about the science of psychology would make no sense. And the departure towards the science of psychology, or the science of the soul, science of the psyche, what psychology is as a discipline, coincided with the time of disillusionment, at least of the educated part of the society of the Western civilization, we could say, roughly around the time of that took between French Revolution and the 19th century, all the way coming to the 20th century. This is the time of disillusionment in a lot of these traditionally held values. So Jung made this quantum leap. He wanted to bridge all the limitations that the West has encountered itself with in terms of lack of what was present. Because there was this gap, there was this fractured picture of reality. And in his view, people like Sigmund Freud did not provide, let's say, coherent enough, all-encompassing enough picture to work with what is happening to a modern human being of his time. So this is the leitmotif which drove Carl Jung into the exploration of other models of consciousness. And now, equipped with this model of consciousness that was already available, widely available in the West because of the previous, let's say, not quite maybe a decade, but not quite a century, but certainly several decades, because the Indian spirituality made its first move to the West, starting with already the late 19th century. You may came across some of the examples and luminaries of Indian culture that are also widely held in high esteem as far back as California. And what comes to mind is the autobiography of the yogi, for example, right? Or the famous presentation of Swami Vivekananda at the Congress, where he, inspired by his teacher, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, went to deliver that complete and utter, bewildering, sweeping everyone off their feet speech about the union of all religions. And this is all, of course, registered and easily accessible. You can simply Google it and look into it for yourself. So, to summarize this, Carl Jung had already quite a solid ground to stand on. So this Atman, Brahman, right, that Sanskrit terms, Atman, which stands for the soul, and Brahman, Sanskrit term that stands for the absolute. That dichotomy, which is the red thread that runs through the entire Indian civilization, entire Indian culture, as the very, very inheritance, as the very, we could say, that what has the vintage point, Atman is Brahman. In other words, this religious predicament is being immediately reconciled here in a sweeping understanding that God is here now, in this very moment, as I am. This soul is nothing other than the utmost reality. So, of course, this is a presupposition. This is a kind of understanding one's supposed to be equipped with whenever one makes the first attempt into delving into this question of who am I, what am I doing here, what is happening to me. So, of course, this is not to say that this doesn't create immediate sense of a release and sets us free there and then. But the presupposition is there. And it is that what attracted Jung very much. But he wanted to give it also a very rich, very, very, I would say, even varied and elaborate account of how he wanted to reconcile all this, what was a byproduct of his own experiences, as well as his practices, what he has encountered with people. So his interest in Tantra was not accidental. And we will talk a bit later how that interest to Tantra, once he has encountered that in real lifetime in India, brought about a kind of radical reconciliation. It is to this that I'd like to speak to this evening. So going back to this, what was laying the intensive impulses on the part of Jung to bring this out into the open, to the peers in the field, was to align certain very intricate understanding that he already prior to that had with all the archetypes, with all the complexity, with all the mythology, with the model that already exists and worked with in Indian culture. So he takes this, and we could say almost superimposes that with his understanding and begins this wild, because it is nothing short of wild interpretation of each and every psychic center, each and every chakra. The notorious text Shat Chakra Nirupana, which was already translated by that time into English by Sir Richard Whitroff, pen name Arthur Avalon, an extraordinary figure who was serving as a governor of Calcutta, I think that was, and apparently went through some internal initiations into the tantric rites whilst he was serving there during the period of the British Raj, and became the first, we could say, white tantrika. It is to him we are indebted for this extraordinary volume, which even Swami Muktananda back in his days praised highly because of its accuracy of translation, accuracy of insights gained. So this text, Shat Chakra Nirupana, which just simply means 6 chakras, right? The gloss on the 6 chakras, the insights on the 6 chakras. Why 6? We will talk about it in a moment. So all this material was available to Jung, and Jung just during this, for example, presentations, right? In this book, they are illustrated with the original drawings, which were drawn for him by a peer in the field, another man who was interested in all this, in all things Indian. See this? Each chakra was given a precise drawing, and all of them are reproduced here with Sanskrit letters in the petals, with the associated symbolic animal in the center of the chakra, and so forth. Leading all the way to the Sahasrara, which is truly cannot be named chakra because it's not a wheel of energy, but often referred to simply by convenience. So anyway, what was happening is extraordinary in the sense that not only Carl Jung had the audacity to bring this topic out into the open, to the peers, and the background that I was trying to refresh myself this last couple of days. I read this book first time about 20 years ago, around early 2000. And whilst going through my own sadhana, through my own intensity of the process, and then I skipped the interview, and I found that the interview is actually just as fascinating as the content of the book. So, what was greatest in my view, insight, and here we could almost say a prophetic vision of Jung, is encapsulated in this passage that I'm going to read you now. Okay, just a very short passage, so that we can begin to make some tentative analogies, okay, to why is it related even to the weekend that we are gathered for, because I believe that most of you are here for what we're going to be doing tomorrow and on Sunday. So Jung claimed that the symbolism of Kundalini Yoga suggested that the bizarre symptomatology that patients at times presented actually resulted from the awakening of the Kundalini. He argued that knowledge of such symbolism enabled much that would be otherwise be seen as the meaningless byproduct of a disease process to be understood as meaningful symbolic process, and explicated the often peculiar physical localizations of symptoms with the hegemony of the biochemical approach to the so-called mental disorders and the rise of the endless succession of wonder drugs such as Prozac. Jung's insistence on the psychogenetic and symbolic significance of such states is even more timely now than back then. See? And someone under the name R.D. Laing stated in this regard, it was Jung who broke the ground here, but few have followed him. So this is where I wanted to bring an emphasis in terms of this impromptu, very much tentatively sensing into how to connect the dots is what I wanted to bring your attention for Jung's foresightness and insight. Back then, we're talking about early 30s, that the symptomatology with which psychologists were already dealing with back then could be, according to Jung, all to do with the phenomenology of what Kundalini is known for and associated with or indispensable from. And that addition, right, of the reviewer, the ground was broken, but very few would follow. You see? So in other words, how many decades now after? We are sitting here 90 years after these historical seminars, and we're finding ourselves pretty much in a very, very similar situation, if not much more acute in its proportion and in its demography, in terms of the widespread neuroses and psychoses that not just the Western culture, but Western culture in particular, is known for today. The pointer was made back then already that allusion can be and perhaps direct. So that what appears to be as something which is a disease to be treated, in fact, is nothing other than a manifestation of a much more refined process. And all the difference here lays in the understanding of the innate nature of the process. And of course, Jung spoke from the place of symbology. To him, the most important thing was understanding the symbology. We can speak today already from a place of enough clinical experiences reported to us over the years in terms of the unifying nature of that process, which on the outside looks downright as a either psychotic episode or a breakdown of some kind or another. You see? So this is simply a suggestion, my perspective, that the greatest contribution that was made by Jung in his time when dealing with this highly complex, refined topic was to suggest that we need to put two and two together and look into this attentively. And yet, despite the fact that this was done in a circle of peace in the field, it was delivered at the club of the psychologists. It wasn't spoken to a layman public. It was spoken to people who are scholars of various kind of disciplines where psychology is a common ground. And yet nobody ventured to go there. We now make a leap several decades to a time when Kundalini now, as it were, reappeared in Western culture because of the systematic nature of certain awakening without which this cannot be spoken, because of the number of very well-known teachers that came from various parts of the Orient active. And there was this man whose name was Lee Sanella, who was the founder of the Kundalini Institute for Kundalini Research. We're talking about sometimes between 70s and 80s. And in one of his essays, which I read and I still have, it's a magazine published by Adidas Samraj community, where excerpt is given of that essay where Lee Sanella spoke about him making this attempt at bringing together into the same audience people of primarily two professions, psychologists and psychiatrists. And he had a woman who was amidst of that rawness of the Kundalini process, there ready and willing to answer their questions, willing to be there, as it were, part of that investigation research. And despite his very passionate address and appeal to the audience, nothing happened. There was deadly silence in the room, according to what Lee Sanella reported. And obviously the reason for that is very simple. No one was prepared to take a risk, to put their career on the line, even take that whole exercise seriously now. You see? And we're talking about what was 50 years ago. 50 years ago. You see, 90 years ago, here in the city, then 50 years ago, somewhere in the United States, possibly in California, and a response is as if nothing is happening. There was no response among professionals. We'll make another leap now. I take you to the publication of the book by approximately 20 authors put under the same cover by Sounds True, with Tammy Simon, the chief editor and founder of the publishing house Sounds True, writing her own introduction. And the book was an attempt to give an updated view on what Kundalini is, with various authors contributing to it from classical to clinical perspectives. One particular part of the book was revelatory as much as it was shocking. I read it when I was during the travels, and we were having our programs across the North America, and we were in Vancouver, in British Columbia. What literally stunned me is the particular part. Fortunately, I don't remember the name of the person, of the author who put this together, but this was more based on the statistics. And the statistics were drawn from North America, from the United States and Canada, where the number was given as follows: 5% of young generation between age of 18 and 30 are diagnosed with unexplainable mental or neurological illness on a yearly basis. 5%. It's a huge number. Huge number. I did an exercise just quickly to see what it actually translates into of the population, and it was a staggering figure. Obviously, what happens to this 5% of people? We don't know. We assume, and the author goes on to develop this, that most of them are being treated. Most of them are being treated because this is no such thing. If you are to go to any authority who has spent any time studying something, then it is their job to treat you. So therefore the treatment would be, even if you don't know what the heck is going on, you are advised to look up or down in the book of entries. You see? Whether it is alphabetic order, whatever order that is. There is a blank entrance. You don't know what it is. Symptomatology is such, okay, look up or down. Up, maybe schizophrenia. Down, God knows, epilepsy. I'm just saying. And that's what the 5% of the population is subjected to. So this is kind of just giving ourselves this overview of what was already addressed by Carl Jung as a proposition to where to direct the investigation, where to direct the attention, as that short excerpt that I read a moment ago, spoke to the symptomatology that simply points out to the great possibility of this having to do with that, how Kundalini experiences are known, what Kundalini experiences are known. So this is what we are indebted to Carl Jung for in terms of his insight, aside from, of course, all the other things that Jung is known for, and even in terms of these particular seminars, which did not produce the desired result. It is known to be producing a great stir in the audience. Many people, most people perhaps, reported the sense of confusion, either among themselves or attributing that to Carl Jung. So now I want to also bring certain points, again, as that opening to our gathering, of where perhaps also Jung can be held accountable in terms of getting it wrong, in terms of perhaps setting off a possibility for a certain trajectory of how this topic is treated. And inevitably, of course, we are right now, we know that this attitude and understanding has been a continued affair, perpetuating to this day, where Kundalini is either marginalized or seen as something that is uniquely pertinent to a certain culture. In other words, it's either marginalized in terms of what it represents as a display of psychophysiological phenomena, or even more, dismissed as being purely Indian, let's say. In other words, having no bearance to or relevance to the day, age, culture, and where we are, where we find ourselves today. Why that happened is because Jung treated the subject inevitably as a scholar. But scholar he was not. He was scholar of the discipline of psychology, but no way a scholar for whom the insight into the depth of what Kundalini is was not available to him. We know for sure that he didn't even work with teachers of his time who would potentially facilitate that access, except, again, having maybe support and feedback from peers in the field. So him going and building these theories and building these interpretations that often also fitted within the narrative of his own work was not doing much justice in terms of the trajectory of how Kundalini would be viewed in years to come, taking us all the way to our present time, and particularly, let's say, how Kundalini became to be viewed by key speakers, figures of the satsang movement and non-duality per se. We know that very well, that Kundalini is being often spoken as just something happening to you at the level of neurophysiology, just something to bear with. Don't worry, this is not the main thing. It will happen, it will go by itself. Or even do not worry, this is just whatever that is, that's not the main goal. You see, this is where the main shortcoming, the main limitation. Because if one has the internal insight into the culture itself, Kundalini is another term, a more rare, yes indeed, more exotic for all that there is. Kundalini is another term for Brahman. Kundalini is another term for Atmas reality. Kundalini is another term for Atman. Kundalini is another term for Divine Mother, for Shakti. Other terms we can find are all bring to the supremacy of consciousness that Kundalini represents in each and every one of us. So Kundalini is not some kind of a side affair that happens to some of us at a certain moment in time, at a certain period in life, if they are lucky or not. If they are blessed, graced, or perhaps cursed, because the variety of perspectives are multiplying by a day. So you see, this understanding was not adjusted from get-going. In other words, was not even brought to the light. In my understanding, if I were to deliver the most severe criticism, it wouldn't be even what Gopi Krishna did, who is known to write several critical assessments of Carl Jung's work, going even to the earlier work, where he made very important adjustments to Carl Jung's misinterpretation of the Vedic myths, particularly those that he borrowed from, as examples, from the ancient Vedic law, ancient Vedic literature, starting with the Rig Veda. Nor is it an unapologetic cutting of a head criticism of someone like Rajneesh or Osho. But that Jung failed to correlate Kundalini with consciousness per se. Kundalini is consciousness, not any aspect of, not as something that represents a portion of a psyche, nor is it something which has to do with the unconscious. Kundalini, if one has a proper understanding, is pranic force that is the mover and shaker of everything. It's the breath we take and the last one we breathe before the time to say goodbye to this temporal manifestation of being in or as the body. Kundalini is all that what is being experienced, because it's that what manifests itself as that electric force without which there are no processes. None. No neural processes possible without first something being in charge. And what is being in charge here? The very charge of what charging it all. So this is a very simple thing that I have to, let's say, to lay as the shortcoming on a part of Carl Jung's historical seminars, and he cannot be blamed for that either, because he was simply not in a position to make that correlation. Neither in terms of his scholarly insights, which he had, I believe, to a rather skin-deep level, nor from the place of direct experience. So these are, if you will, that this kind of, with all fairness of my own understanding. Something else I wanted to point out here also, in relation to all this, is the point in time where Carl Jung himself took a kind of U-turn on his first very passionate affair with Tantrism. And funny enough, that happened after his visit to India, after he received all these coveted awards in Calcutta and in city of Benares, Varanasi, where he was invited by the British Academia, by the Oxford University, to be among the presenters and speakers, and then harvested this highly sought after awards of recognition of his contribution in a field of Hindu thought. Who would have thought? So instead, coming back in his correspondence, in his journals, we find almost like him having a second thought. And this is interesting because what it begins to resurface is that whole doubt among the educated in the West that this profound, without any shadow of a doubt, methodologies of consciousness that India is known for are actually useful for a Western man or for a Western psyche. If in fact these methodologies and these philosophies are of any use for a people of Western civilization. And Jung used the term Europeans and Westerners interchangeably. So it's interesting that this line of thought was already present. So Jung simply was rejoining or joining that camp of those who, coming from a place of not just a doubt, from the place of critical position, that they are indeed profound. All this, what Indians came up with, is profound and unparalleled. But is it worth or even applicable for the Western human being? Remains to be an open question, and according to some, it has no value because it's inapplicable. The vastness in terms of the differences between the very premises of Eastern culture and what was considered to be the highest, loftiest understanding of what's the purpose of the West, as that what is exemplified in the freedom of the individual, that democracy. In other words, the expression of individuality is at stake here. Whereas Eastern perspective denouncing individuality from get-going. You see the dilemma? So that's what prompted Jung to cool off from his passionate interest in Tantra. And he became quite an active advocate of the differences rather than unifying principles. And we could also understand why this work perhaps never gained a wider recognition, because Jung himself, later Jung, was not at all that keen. You see? So I thought to add here simply as something suspended in the air, something as a question mark. Not that I'm jumping here to give the ready-made answer, although it's tempting, of course, because there is something that naturally almost wanting to speak itself and unfold itself, because there are these, without any doubt, attempts that were made also simultaneously with all this, what we spoke about just now, in historical terms, in giving us the reassurance that the true perennial wisdom, the true perennial truth, transcends the boundaries of any differences. So at the core of who we are, even at the level of the qualities of our psyche, let alone that unified field that unites us all, we are neither Indian, nor German, no Austrian, no American, or what have you. In other words, there are these foundational, fundamental qualities, and these foundational, fundamental qualities that are of utmost importance in terms of what we lean on. That's what makes us truly humans. You see, again, this is simply offered into the conversation, into this opening, not as a postulate, but as something to reflect on. So, okay, folks, this is an concise, if you will, kind of version of paying tribute to the city where I wanted to speak this for the first time, so I couldn't resist. And I will be very happy to now give this to the unfoldment of the evening, and we can speak about anything that you choose to bring out into the open as the topic of our exchanges. It can be in relation to your own personal, very intimate dilemmas. It could be in relation to the workshop or the program that we have for Saturday, Sunday. Or if you want anything with regard to what we just spoke, I'm absolutely open to any of that.